Hello and welcome back to the History of Bangalore. I'm Ramjee Chandran and this is episode 81 of season 2. We begin a new chapter today, not just in the history of Bengaluru, but in the kind of history that I'm about to tell. Until now, the story has been largely local, a dynasty, a city, a plateau, a family that built something from nothing and held it for over a century. But from here, the frame widens considerably. The forces that will now affect Bangalore's fate are not the local Paligars nursing grudges over market revenues or a stray insult. These are empires. And the thinking that drives those empires, the intellectual architecture of how they make war, that is what this episode will be about. The shifting sands of the Deccan, and the two catechisms of war that were about to collide. One of them inside Bengaluru's mud fort. The first attack that Bengaluru had to defend happened quickly. It happened in 1612. I told you about that in the last episode. And this episode will be the story of what led to the Second Battle of Bengaluru. This is part 1 of a 2-part series. But before I get into how that happened, I would like to thank my sponsors, the Prestige Group, with whose support I can bring you this podcast. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. Sun Tzu, the Chinese philosopher, wrote, "The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. History treats it roughly." Warfare in the medieval Deccan has been the subject of serious study by military historians. And what that study reveals when you look at it carefully and read a large number of books is something way more interesting than battles and generals. It actually reveals a clash of ideas. And now we have two entirely different intellectual traditions, in the true sense of the word, about how a state should think, plan, and fight. But before I get to the battle in 1638, we need to understand those traditions, because they explain not just how the battles unfolded, but why it could only have unfolded the way it did. The royalty and the aristocracy, which means the kings, the princes, and the generals of medieval India, were educated soldiers, trained from childhood in the Arthashastra and the Niti Shastra, among the oldest military manuals known to the world. Now, these were not dusty texts that were stored in some palace library. They were the living intellectual catechism for every prince and every peer. Their study was not optional. It was the foundation of command and the foundation of their education. What is worth noting is how quickly war attracts the application of science, psychology, and method. Military thinking distinguishes between objectives, which is the political aims, the strategy, which is the comprehensive plan to achieve the objectives, and tactics, the specific methods employed on the battlefield. Now, these terms have suffered what I would call a great deal of sophistry in modern usage, applied everywhere from business management to sports coaching. Sophistry basically means deceptive or overcomplicated reasoning, because it matters to me that we must mark the difference between the horrors, that is war, and the pedantics of daily life. When a CEO or a marketing executive uses the word tactics, he or she lacks the life and death stakes that give the word its meaning. In the medieval Deccan, it was even more. The aristocracy of medieval India was rooted in the belief that the state was a living organism and that war was its most demanding function. Every commander operated from that shared intellectual playbook, the Shastric tradition, which viewed warfare as both a science and a ritual. It taught a commander to see the battlefield not as chaos, but like a mathematical grid. They practiced the vyuha, the complex geometric troop formations with names like the lotus and the eagle, designed to trap or pierce an enemy with the precision of chess in the hands of grandmasters. Their strategy was rooted in the mandalas, the circle of states theory which mapped allies and enemies not by sentiment or history, but by geography alone. A neighbor is always a potential threat. A neighbor's neighbor is always a potential ally. The system was cold, it was systematic, and it was effective. And especially on the Deccan Plateau, that's all the areas around Bengaluru, for instance, The earth itself was the weapon. South Indian military tradition had perfected the art of science of the hill fort, turning the tall basalt cliffs like Nandi Durga or Savana Durga into near impenetrable stone sentinels that could exhaust an invading army for years. Patience was a weapon, terrain was a weapon, the mathematics of defense was a weapon. And then there's the Persian school, the school that shaped the Mughal military and by extension the Bijapur Sultanate, and that operated from entirely different principles. While the South Indian tradition was geometric, holistic, and patient, the Persian tradition was mechanical. It trained soldiers to be machines of war. The Mughals used what they called the Mansabdari system, a rigid numerical hierarchy that turned every nobleman into a professional bureaucrat soldier, ranked, accountable, and easily replaceable, importantly. The Persian method placed enormous emphasis on what they call roob or awe, as in shock and awe. And this roob was achieved by a very deliberate and systematic deployment of forces of an overwhelming presence even before the first blow was struck. Massive mobile tent cities that moved like entire small civilizations across the landscape. Grand processions, super artillery, always visible, and a practice that would have seemed extraordinary to any local polygar watching from a distance. And then there was the net of paper, an army of news writers and spies who reported every movement, every development, every change in conditions back to the emperor. This was real-time intelligence by the standards of the 17th century. Now the emperor, wherever he may have sat, think about Delhi or maybe the Sultan in Bijapur, never lost his grip because he knew exactly how his machine was functioning. And in terms of tactics, the Persians introduced what might be called the science of the siege. They had sabat, which were covered approach trenches that allowed the infantry to advance even under fire. Then they had massive artillery, mining operations that could collapse the walls of the forts that had stood for centuries. This was the work of the early sappers. The siege was not some sort of improvised escalation of force. It was a mathematical certainty. You brought more force than the defender could absorb, you applied it with patience and precision, and the outcome was never in question. So, this was a clash between the ancient geometric warrior-monk tradition of the South and the high-tech bureaucratic superpower logic of the Sultanate forces and the Mughals. And history's verdict is uncomfortable. The Indian school was more enduring, more holistic, it could win wars. But in the face of devastating weaponry, and in the presence of something else that the South Indians had never perfected, which was the art of deception, of spies, and of treachery. Now these two elements, canon and betrayal, had broken Vijayanagara at Rakasagi Tangrigi in 1565, and they were about to break Bengaluru in 1638. But to understand how that army arrived at Bengaluru's gates, let's step back a little more, because nothing about this was sudden. It's time now for a commercial break, and when I get back, let's jump right into what happened. Right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools, and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals, and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. Radar approved.
If we panned out a little bit, when Vijayanagara fell in 1565, it didn't just end an empire, it ended an order. For 2 centuries, Vijayanagara had been the great anchor of the southern Deccan, of the entire south, a buffer, a referee, a superpower that kept the peninsula coherent and kept the ambitious northern empires at bay. But when that anchor, Vijayanagara, disappeared, everything that it had been holding in place began to drift. What ought to have replaced Vijayanagara was another southern power capable of filling the vacuum. Vijayanagara was the last in a line of several such powers. The Deccan Sultanates, 5 states, ambitious and experienced, they were the obvious candidates. But they were not capable of unity. They distrusted each other as much as they feared outside powers. They squabbled over territory. They looked south through very narrow provincial eyes, not through the wide lens of empire which the Mughals were doing. And so this vacuum held, unfulfilled and waiting. North of the Narmada, the Mughal engine was running at full capacity. The Emperor Akbar had swept east and west. By the 1590s, he started to look south. His targets first were the 5 Bhavani breakaway sultanates, Bijapur, Ahmednagar, Golconda, Bidar and Berar. One by one, these states started to feel the weight of a Mughal machine, more organized and more resourced than anything the Deccan had encountered before. Ahmednagar resisted the longest. Under their brilliant general Malik Ambar, it sustained a form of guerrilla warfare against the Mughals for decades. But after Ambar's death in 1626, all resistance collapsed. By 1633, the Nizam Shahi dynasty was finished, and in 1636, Shah Jahan, who was the new emperor now, imposed the Treaty of 1636, a settlement that absorbed Ahmednagar into the Mughal Empire and fixed the limits of the northern boundaries for both Bijapur and Golconda. And that treaty is the key to understanding why Bijapur attacked Bengaluru. Because their northern frontiers had been fixed, expansion towards the Mughals foreclosed by treaty, Bijapur and Golconda had only one direction left in which to expand, the south, into the Mysore Deccan. The situation now was a loosely knit region where the Palegars operated now without a real functioning imperial overlord, and you really can't count the Aravidus dynasty as being one of those. This was a place where a fortified, revenue-producing city sat exposed on the plateau. Bengaluru was that city. By the 1620s, it had completed its transition from a planned market town to a fully functioning urban center. Its estimated annual revenue ran approximately 50,000 varahas. It sat right in the middle of all the trade routes linking the eastern plains to the southern plateau and west coast to east coast and everywhere into the deep south. It had markets, it had water infrastructure, it had layered defenses. It was, in the language of the time, ruling in wealth. And the Palegars around it, resentful of its success, diminished by its prosperity, without a central authority to appeal to or an overlord to enforce any agreements really, they were not going to defend it. They were going to enable the fall of Bengaluru. And that trigger came from the chief of Hoskote. He is referred to in some accounts as Chikkarayalu. He had quarreled with Immadi Kempegowda. The exact cause of that quarrel is lost to records, but what is not lost is the consequence. Chikkaraya appealed to Muhammad Adil Shah of Bijapur for military assistance against Bengaluru. And that was a very fateful letter, because Bijapur was already looking south. So, by early 1638, the Bijapur army was assembling. Its commander was a man called Ranadullah Khan, son of nobles of African descent. He was the supreme commander of the Bijapur military, and he had been awarded the titles like Khani Zaman and Rustami Zaman, Lord of the Era, Warrior of the Era, and these were not titles that were given lightly. With him rode a second general, his junior, 44 years old, battle-hardened across decades of conflict, a Maratha, and his name was Shahaji Bhonsle. He was the father of Shivaji. The Bijapur force was awesome. 40,000 cavalry, 100,000 infantry. That train was ready to move, and move they did into the Deccan. What's interesting is that army did not march directly to Bengaluru, and in fact, Bengaluru was not on their plans in their first campaign. Their first target was Adoni and Tadapatri, which is in today's Andhra Pradesh. Something redirected them to Bengaluru, and this was a local campaign advisor, Kenga Hanumantappa Nayaka of Basavapatna. Kenga Nayaka was friends with the Tadapatri Palegar, and he did a deal with him. So he was able to bend Ranadullah Khan's ear, and he asked him not to attack Tadapatri, and the message went out to him. Turn south, there's a much more lucrative target, Bengaluru, where Kempegowda ruled in wealth. Ranadullah relayed the suggestion, And Adil Shah from Bijapur immediately agreed because that's what he wanted. And then the great army of Bijapur turned south. From the ramparts of Bengaluru's mud fort, the sight of that army making camp on the plain below must have been extraordinary. Camp spreading to the edge of the horizon. An army of a scale the city had never seen before, equipped with weapons its walls were not built to withstand, and carrying with it in its formation and its methods the full weight of the Persian Catechism of war. Against it, what did Imedi Kempegowda have? A mud fort, committed soldiers no doubt, no cannons. And that imbalance would lead to the second battle of Bengaluru. And that is where we will go in the next episode. In the next episode, we will go directly into the second battle of Bengaluru in 1638. It lasted 3 days, and that will be part 2 of this story. It's coming up very soon. In fact, check to see if it's already there. In the meanwhile, I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the history of Bangalore.